Hello, History 362. So today we're going to talk about the end of the Antigonid dynasty. Now we left off after the Seleucid War, in which Philip V had sided with the Romans enthusiastically and had provided significant material aid, in particular aiding the passage of Roman armies across Macedonia and Thrace so that they can cross the Hellespont and confront Antiochus the Great. And Philip had been rewarded for his services. Among other things, the remainder of his indemnity had been waived by the Romans. And it seems that Philip may also have some of the limitations on his military activities lifted, including a limitation on the size of his army. Now, Philip, therefore, after the end of the war with Antiochus the Great, is actually in a better position than the Seleucids are. Remember, Antiochus the Great is killed trying to loot a temple in 187, and Philip is back on the upswing. And indeed, in the last 8 years of his reign, he dies in 179 BC, Philip really engages in a rebuilding project and renovation project that really seeks to revive Macedonian power. This is, again, what political scientists would call internal strengthening. And this has a couple of aspects. One, a key aspect is going to be immigration. Philip, who, remember, we read that letter he wrote in 217 BC to Larissa. And this is about a kind of internal dispute he's having with the governance of this city. It seems that they're not enrolling a certain number of people. It's been speculated, I think plausibly, that the people who aren't being enrolled are some kind of veterans or military settlers that Philip once enrolled in the city. But he's having this dispute about citizen rolls. And all of a sudden, out of kind of, out of nowhere, he starts talking about the Romans. It talks about how expansive their citizenship is. It talks about how they give citizenship to freed slaves. And clearly, in his head, this is even before the First Macedonian War, he's thinking about the dynamics of power and population. And this is something that Philip clearly continues to think about, because he really knows one reason why he lost the Second Macedonian War is he simply couldn't raise a big enough army to counter the Roman expeditionary force. So he really tries to increase his population. Some of this is going to probably be just population recovery, especially as the casualties of Kunos Kephali are regenerated over the course of the next generation. But he also encourages immigration, bringing in Thracians and Celts from the outside, giving them land. And then not only do they add to the tax base, because now they're producing produce, and Macedonia partially funds itself through a property tax. If you've got a farmer who's farming a plot, he may be Thracian, but he's paying taxes. And of course, they add to his military manpower. So he's thinking about demographics, and when he's thinking about demographics, the solution is immediately immigration to supplement the kind of natural recovery of the Macedonian population. He also works to revive the mining areas that seem to have somehow gone into a bit of disuse. It's possible that Macedonia, over the 3rd century, as it sort of secures a hegemony, is bringing in enough revenues from Greece in tribute that it doesn't need to exploit the mines as intensively. Now that it's lost all those revenues, because now freedom for the Greeks has been proclaimed, Philip focuses on reviving the mining industry up around Amphipolis and in Thrace. And it seems that this also is paying off. So he's boosting his manpower, he's boosting his finances. He also starts to engage in conquests in areas that the Romans may not care as much about, namely against Balkan peoples who live kind of to the around the northern parts of the Macedonian frontier, Lopians and Pannonians, people that actually do complain to Rome, but the Romans aren't probably going to respond the same way as if they get a complaint from Sparta or Rhodes or Pergamon. So also by acquiring hegemony over these new regions, he's also broadening his territorial base. And for a while, the Romans seem okay with this. Indeed, the period after the Second Macedonian War and the war with Antiochus particularly is a period of Roman disengagement over the course of the 180s. The Romans are interested in other places, Cisalpine Gaul and Spain, and they seem less concerned with the East. They do a lot of diplomacy, but they're not interested in sending big armies over there. And so Philip actually sees a kind of revived, thriving kingdom late in his reign. He does, however, have a late dynastic strife that mars the end of his life. Namely, he has two sons, as is very common in the way that Macedonian kings or Hellenistic kings practice royal polygamy. They come from two different wives. And of course, the sons dispute who's a wife and who's just a dancing girl. The oldest son, probably the logical successor always, is Perseus. The youngest son, whose name is Demetrius, is seen as very friendly with the Romans, and indeed cultivates a relation with diplomatic relations and even personal relations with big Roman senators. And there's kind of rumors that if Rome wants a successor, they don't want Perseus, they'd rather have his younger brother. Now, in this context, Perseus arranges to accuse his younger brother of treason and has him executed the year before Philip dies. This actually seems to be a little shocking in Rome, as again this kid had been popular and had friends, and so his execution already kind of leaves a bad taste in the mouth of a lot of Roman senators when they think about this new king. But nonetheless, in 179, Philip finally dies of old age and is succeeded by his son Perseus, who proves an equally energetic king and really continues all of the internal strengthening projects that his father had been engaged in. So what this means is that Macedonia, which had been on the brink of ruin in 197 BC, looks actually like one of the more viable of the Hellenistic kingdoms again by the time we get to the late 170s BC. And of course, this may be one answer to the question is why all of a sudden, after over a decade of relative disinterest in Eastern affairs, do the Romans spark a crisis that leads to the Third Macedonian War? Again, there have been a number of arguments. Some historians, particularly a historian named William Harris, basically sees the Romans as inherently belligerent, always looking for a war, and Perseus just became a good target. Another historian named Eric Ruin has argued that the Romans may come to regret their disengagement in the Greek East and therefore are trying to diplomatically re-engage, particularly with some states that are becoming worried about Perseus's waxing power, including, again, Pergamon and Rhodes, although Pergamon, seeing that the Romans are disinterested and Perseus is flourishing, is kind of starting to think about playing both sides. Nonetheless, there are a lot of Greek city-states who are starting to become somewhat alarmed by Perseus's rising power and are sending reports of like, look, he's got all this money stockpiled, he's got all this grain stockpiled, he's got a huge royal armory. And so Gruen has argued, well, the Romans may not be concerned about Perseus himself, but they're trying to work with their Greek friends. Working with your Greek friends sometimes means building coalitions and conducting diplomacy and occasionally going to war, and it just goes there. I think there's something to be said about that, although I ultimately buy the argument of a historian named Arthur Eckstein, who suggests that the Romans are just concerned themselves about Perseus's waxing power. The Greek city-states certainly are, but the Romans may just see that, again, the Romans have suffered terrible devastation during the Hannibalic War. There are still people alive who remember this, and they may simply feel that they don't want Perseus gaining the kind of power in the well-trained army that could potentially be a broader threat, both to the region and even to the Mediterranean, including Italy. Maybe a bit paranoid, perhaps, but again, Hannibal was far away, and then he was very close for the Romans. The paranoia is not necessarily unjustified. Regardless, as Perseus's power waxes, and as Perseus, who may himself be growing in confidence, really doesn't respond to kind of Roman diplomatic bluster, the Romans declare war on Perseus in 171. And here I would suggest that it is more of a Roman initiative to declare this war, rather than necessarily Perseus, going on a rampage in the kind of the same way that Philip V had been going on a rampage in the Aegean that had so alarmed the Romans prior to the Second Macedonian War. So now we have the Third Macedonian War, the Third Roman War, if you're the Macedonians. And the dynamics are actually somewhat similar in that the Romans quickly dispatch looks like a large consular army, but they struggle in the early years of the war to get a lot of traction. They do manage to, again, fight their way into Thessaly. Although in Thessaly, they engage in a battle in 170, the Battle of Callinicus. It's mostly a kind of cavalry light infantry skirmish, so we don't yet have the legions clashing with the phalanx. But the Romans lose. They're chased away, and supposedly Perseus's Thracian soldiers cut off the heads of dead Romans and put them on their scythe-like swords called sica and parade them before Perseus. So the war, the Romans are frustrated in the early years of the war. They suffer at least a modest defeat, and they're definitely not making the kind of progress that they want. Therefore, they elect a new consul for 168, and that is Aemilius Paulus. Notably, he's been a consul before. He's engaged in successful military operations against the Ligurians. It seems that he campaigns, at least arguing that he has the capacity to bring the war to an end, although maybe he still gets that command because of the lots. Romans draw lots for commands, and the sources disagree on whether they assign it to him without drawing lots or whether he just has to do it randomly. Either way, he gets the command. Now, Paulus is, on one hand, a talented general. He's also extremely cautious, and indeed he seems really hesitant to actually confront Perseus's army in a pitched battle. It seems that if he had his druthers, he would try to just outmaneuver Perseus. And initially, some of his maneuvers are successful. So, for example, he forces his way into Macedonia by initially positioning his army like it's going to come up the coast, and then sends a flying column around a huge and famous landmark, Mount Olympus, to try to see if he can outflank Perseus. And Perseus gets wind of this tactic and withdraws, but this allows Paulus to now enter into Macedonia. But he consistently, rather than trying to actually bring the war to a pitched battle, prefers to keep maneuvering. And it seems his own soldiers are getting frustrated. Why won't you fight Perseus? Well, the answer is he's probably darn scared of the very large 43,000-man army that Perseus has put together. And here Perseus benefits from the internal strengthening policies of his father and that he had continued. This is the largest number of Macedonian phalangites we have fighting in one place. The army is actually bigger than the army that Alexander has when he crosses to Asia. And it's also supplemented by a lot of these immigrant groups, Thracians and Celts who have been farmers and now are actually joining the Macedonian army in their own contingent. So it's a big army with a big pike phalanx, and Paulus seems to be a little nervous about whether his army can beat it. And so, again, this kind of the maneuver continues, and finally the two armies are facing off against one another. They've got their camps across one another. They're sort of drawing up every day, but not giving battle. And this is near the town of Pydna, the Macedonian port of Pydna. Finally, a skirmish breaks out, supposedly over an escaped horse or an escaped mule. Our sources disagree, an equid. And this skirmishing kind of escalates. Both sides are initially, just the people chasing a mule and some pickets, but both sides start adding soldiers, and it seems that Perseus decides that he is now going to draw up his whole army and commit it to battle against the Romans. And initially, the Macedonian phalanx forms and charges, and as with the case of Kunos Kephalai, it proves irresistible. The Romans are pushed back, supposedly to within around 200 meters of their camp. And supposedly, later at dinner parties, Paulus tells people that the most terrifying thing that he had ever seen was the charge of the Macedonian phalanx commanded by Perseus. Now, for those of you in 363, we've talked a little bit about how the Roman army looks different from a big, dense Hellenistic pike phalanx. Suffice to say, the Romans deploy in little kind of modular companies called maniples, who are arrayed in kind of 3 lines. And so it doesn't have the density or the kind of momentum of a phalanx, but it does have a lot of flexibility. And ultimately, what happens at the Battle of Pydna is that flexibility and modularity pays off, and that as Perseus's phalanx charges, it's irresistible for a while, but then it hits a little, a little gully or a little stump or a little ditch or a little fence, and gaps start to form. And the Romans are able to send their little maniples, the companies into which their soldiers are organized, into these gaps to infiltrate the phalanx. And once as long as the Macedonians can keep within 20 feet of the Romans, they've got the advantage. They've got these huge, long sarissa. But as soon as the Romans get within, 19, 18, 15, 10 feet, they start to have the advantage because they can now close with their swords. And so once the Roman maniples start to infiltrate the various gaps that open up in the charging but increasingly discombobulated phalanx, they're able to start carving it up on the inside, kind of like little Cuisinart blades. And this is ultimately how the battle goes from being within the first 15 or 20 minutes. It looks like, the Macedonians are just going to bowl over the Romans. And then within the hour, it is the Romans who are slaughtering the completely disorganized and hapless Macedonians. So it is another massive Roman victory. Supposedly upwards of 20,000 Macedonian soldiers are killed, and nearly as many are enslaved. And Roman cavalry chases the survivors for miles. So this is a devastating defeat that basically ends the Third Macedonian War once and for all. Perseus himself flees, but of course it seems that the Macedonian nobility itself has lost faith in his ability, and this is the downside of having an ideology about spear-won land and the king as ultimately a military commander. You suffer a massive defeat, and all of a sudden you look around and people don't have the same confidence they had in you yesterday. So Perseus flees, but is captured by the Romans at Samothrace, this ends the war. The Romans occupy Macedonia. Aemilius Paulus, as he's waiting for Roman commissioners to come to hash out the peace settlement, takes a tour of Greece. At Delphi, he sees a pillar that Perseus had been erecting for himself. And this is a common thing that Hellenistic kings do. They sort of put up big pillars. And Paulus says, well, that was Perseus's pillar, but I guess it's mine now. He puts a Latin, he rubs out the Greek inscription. He puts in a Latin inscription. And on the top, there is a frieze showing Roman soldiers massacring the Macedonians. And then on the very top of the statue, we have the frieze, but really not much rest of the pillar. On the very top of the pillar would have been, instead of statue of Perseus, they put a statue of Aemilius Paulus. The ultimate peace settlement is going to be that Macedonia, the Antigonid dynasty is over. Perseus is taken as a prisoner to Rome. He's paraded in Aemilius Paulus's triumphal procession, and then he is held as a prisoner in a Latin colony and dies shortly afterwards, possibly after being mistreated. His son eventually becomes a Roman citizen and is known as a mildly prominent goldsmith in Rome. So that is there is no more Antigonid dynasty, and there are now no more Macedonian kings. The Macedonian monarchy, we've seen these two dynasties, the Argead dynasty of Alexander and then the Antigonid dynasty. I guess we could argue there's the Cassander in between, but the Macedonian monarchy is now over. Rome decides that it is not going to turn Macedonia into a province. Rather, it's going to divide it up into 4 separate republics. And these republics probably mirror the royal administrative districts of the Antigonids. And these districts are going to have to pay some tribute to Rome now. So now Macedonian is permanently tributary to Rome, not just an indemnity, where you pay until it's paid up. But every year they have to send half of the taxes they had previously sent to the king to Rome. And the republics are themselves forbidden from having certain kinds of connections to one another, including they're not allowed to marry someone from a different republic. Two of the republics are allowed to maintain a military presence, however, precisely because the Romans aren't committing any troops to defending the northern frontier, which of course, it's the Macedonians who keep the northern barbarians out. With that, the last Roman armies withdraw. Macedonia is now for republics. But this is, I think, a huge moment. This is the first of the dynasties, the successor dynasties, to be wiped out by Rome. So we'll leave it with that. Next time we'll talk about the pretender who in 150 BC claims to be a son of Perseus, and this leads to not only the Fourth Macedonian War, but also a war with the Achaean League. So we'll talk soon.